So nice to be here. It's like being in somebody's living room. It's really terrific because living rooms and kitchens are places where people's stories, your family history, that's all where that happens, and that's all where that takes place. And stories are powerful. Stories have the power to connect people through their strong emotions that run through them. They have the power to shape and color the various experiences we're talking about. And stories have a way of connecting people, family, friends, whole communities, sometimes by the strong emotions that are running through them, and other times by how a single event can totally change the course of one's life, often forever. So I'd like to share with you one of those days that I had, one of those events, and I don't remember most of it. But I do remember the numbers. 4, 5, 6. 4, 5, 6. They were bright, red, digital numbers. They're right there in my field of vision. And I squinted to get a better look. But then they were gone. What else do I remember? I was cold. I remember that. And yeah, of course, I remember the blood. But long before that day, I grew up in a small town where kids were still able to play outside till the streetlights came on. As a teenager, society was in transition, sometimes painfully so. I'd been taught to stand up for myself and to stand up for others. After school, my friends and I would gather and plan where we would meet on the weekends to protest against the war in Vietnam or against racial injustice. I went to college and law school. The years flew by. It seems like all of a sudden I found myself in suburbia, a young widow with a little girl and a law degree in hand. So I went to work for the district attorney's office, and there I handled thousands of serious criminal cases: murders, rapes, robberies, home invasions. And over the course of 10 years, I tried about 150 jury trials, and that's how I came to know and advocate for some really good and decent people like everybody else, like everybody in this room, whose lives had been totally upended, again, by a single event, a single moment on a certain day. At the end of the day, or at the conclusion of a trial, I held out hope that maybe somebody might just sleep a little better that night or feel a little safer. I hoped. And after 10 years, I went to work for a different governmental agency. I was chosen to be in charge of a group of attorneys and investigators, and we looked at particularly challenging, really uncomfortable cases like animal cruelty, dog and cockfighting for money, gambling, sexually oriented businesses. But that's when I first learned about human trafficking. Human trafficking is a $32 billion industry. When I first heard that number, I thought, $32 billion? How do I wrap my brain around $32 billion? I really couldn't even fathom what that was like. So I did a little research, and I learned that in 2014, as one example, ExxonMobil had a profit of about $16.8 billion. So here we have human trafficking, which basically is the buying and selling over and over of human beings, the buying and selling of slaves, really, generating more than twice that amount of money of a commodity we use on a daily basis. It was horrifying, but I was intrigued and I wanted to learn more. And I found out that the UN estimates that at any given time throughout the world, about 2.5 million people are being trafficked. And of those 2.5 million people, about 80% of them are caught up in the commercial sex slave trade. Trafficking is an especially vicious crime. And you may know this, but Houston is actually a hub of human trafficking. So much so that it caught the attention of the Department of Justice, who designated I-10 as a major corridor for the transportation of guns, drugs, and people. In all the years that I had been dealing with these serious crimes, I had never seen anything quite as vicious and debasing and soul-stealing as human trafficking. Its victims are often lured and ensnared by very innocuous ways. And then immediately, they're beaten, drugged, raped, threatened to keep them compliant. And traffickers prey on the most vulnerable people in society. The poor, the uneducated. And yet nobody asks to be born into poverty. Every parent hopes that their child will receive even just a basic education. Everyone is entitled to equal rights and basic human dignity. Because after all, but for the lottery of birth, it could very well be me or you or our brother or sister or daughter or children. As part of my work, I've been inside so many of those locations. Locations where scantily clad young girls sit on cheap folding chairs along the perimeter of the room, waiting to be summoned by nameless strangers to do whatever has been paid for, 15 or 20 or more times a night. These girls were so young. About the time that you and I were going to middle school, or our kids were going to middle school, or even younger, when we were thinking about when we'd be grown up enough to go to middle school. These girls were so young and so vulnerable and so full of fear and shame. Back in that small town, I was taught that when you see something is wrong, you don't turn away. You try to fix it. And I'd always been inspired by Elie Wiesel, who said, there may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest. So I began to focus our group solely on human trafficking. I was working with a new model. It was a combination of using civil remedies to close criminal businesses. In that first year alone, we closed about 50 locations, and I was so excited to see that this model worked. Month by month, we gained momentum. And as we gained momentum, the traffickers were finding that their momentum and their cash flow slowing down. And I can tell you that anytime you get between a crook and their money, you automatically become a person of interest. They started following me. They knew where I worked. They learned where I lived. And they conspired to send a message to me. As you may well imagine, during this period of time full of relentless crime and misery, the weekends were a welcome time to maybe have a few hours in a row to read or to run a few errands. And I remember on Saturday, September 17th, 2011, I came home about 1:30 in the afternoon. And I remember I came in the back door, I put my keys on the hook, walked into the kitchen, put my purse on the kitchen counter, and that's about the last thing I remember clearly. But then came those numbers, those bright red numbers, and I remember looking at them, vaguely wondering, what are they? What are they doing there? Until I finally realized it was the clock on the microwave. I'd been unconscious on my kitchen floor for hours. It was 4:56. The time was 4:56. They weren't random numbers. The time was 4:56. I stood up. And I suddenly realized I had a blinding, excruciating headache. Somehow, later on, I made it to my bed. And when I woke up the next morning, I stood up, as I always do, and boom, immediately I fell. I had no balance. So using the wall as an anchor, I slowly made my way to the restroom, and I came back, and on that day, that Sunday, one of life's little miracles worked in my favor. My phone was ringing, and it was a friend. And he said, "What's going on? How are you?" And I said, "I have a really bad headache, and I'm bruised." And he said, "Well, what happened?" I said, I don't know." He said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And I said, I don't know. So he said, "Well, I'm coming by to take you to the hospital." I said, "No, I'll be fine. Or I'll go to a doc in the box. I'm good." And we had a little bit of a back and forth on that. And fortunately, he went out. But by that time, I was really feeling so bad. I said, "I'm going to go back to bed. I'll just unlock the door. Come on in when you get there." And I did go back to bed, and I closed my eyes for a while. But I'll never forget when I opened my eyes, and I looked up, and I saw him in the threshold of my door. And it was like he stopped in mid-sentence with a look of utter horror on his face. And when he saw that I saw him, he quickly recovered and smiled and said, "Okay, let's go." So he took me to an ER where every inch of my body was examined, scanned, and x-rayed. And one by one, the doctors came in and said, "Who did this to you?" Then the nurses came in and said, "Who did this to you?" I don't know. So they followed it up with the social workers. Slightly different approach. "Who did this to you, honey?" I still don't know. I don't know. But you see, they all knew what I couldn't remember, because they knew that I had received a skull fracture. I had received a traumatic brain injury. Actually, a traumatic brain injury to the extent that I had what's called contra-coup injuries, and that basically means that the force and the velocity of the blows caused my brain to ricochet against my skull back and forth, which in turn caused very deep tissue bleeding, which then caused my brain to swell and bulge against the top of my skull. That, I learned, is a serious condition. My face had been battered like a punching ball. And it was swollen and almost even with my nose. My right eye was swollen shut. And I had a deep dent, open and bleeding at the time, in the back of my head. And actually, I can still feel it, and I can still put my finger in it. The doctors were certain that I had been beaten to within an inch of my life. And their diagnosis was solidified by the clear, distinct impression of fist-sized bruises on my chest and under my chin. And in those bruises, you could clearly see the impression of knuckles, and in one, you could actually see a man's ring. I was immediately admitted into the neuro ICU, where I stayed for a while. And then I was eventually discharged with my discharge papers and a prescription for pain relief. And I came home to an empty house and that bloody pillowcase. And I really hesitated, but I was so tired and still in so much pain, I felt like I had no choice. I just put my head right back down on it and rested for a while. My friends who had been active in the same anti-trafficking work I had been doing called and checked, and they were saying, you gotta get out. You gotta get out of your house for a while. Because actually it was literally the scene of the crime. But I had no memory of what had happened, and the idea of moving was so exhausting. I just ignored them. Until finally, another trusted friend of mine who had seen so much more of this segment of society said to me one day, he said, Linda, what is it going to take for me to convince you that somebody came in your house and tried to kill you? That convinced me. It was the tone of his voice and the fact he knew, he'd worked in this field, he knew what he was talking about. I finally realized it. I finally got it. This was the trafficker's message. Get out and stay out of our business. The next few weeks were really a blur, and moments of clarity were very sporadic. But slowly I did begin to heal, and slowly the process of recovery had begun. Eventually, the pain mostly subsided. But I could never figure out, even with all the doctors I was seeing at the time, I could never figure out what to do with my ever racing heartbeat that comes after you've been beaten to a pulp and left to die. The hypervigilance, the insomnia, the anxiety, the fear. I didn't know what to do with that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that just those crooks probably right around the corner. They're going to come back. Doctors, they were great. But I still was dealing with this. And one night I thought, well, maybe having a drink would help. So I did. And it didn't. So I'd have another and another and another. And really, with a brain injury, your judgment is not so good. And another and another and another. Until finally, I remember this. It was about 3 a.m. And it was very memorable because dealing with all of these things, and as I had gotten better slowly and started to heal, slowly I also started to get angry. Angry at the crooks who had done this to me, and even angrier at the system's apparent inability to find them. I knew something had to be done. So this former peace protesting, civil rights activist, current mom and grandma got herself a gun, learned how to shoot it, practiced at the firing range, got my license. And I got a dog. Dogs bark, kind of helps create a feeling of safety. I got a really large Doberman. Enhance the whole experience. And while I was taking these steps to try to make myself feel safe, to calm down something that I wasn't able to do. And so that's when this whole experiment, many of us still experiment with in smaller amounts, Friday and Saturday nights, but this was for medicinal purposes. And so I would have a drink over and over, and there I was on the porch at about 3 a.m. after countless drinks with my puppy and my pistol. And I was dry firing my pistol over and over at faceless targets, a gun without bullets. And at that moment, I had a fleeting but very profound insight, and that was that something's going to change. I have got to change. So I tossed the alcohol, for the most part. I kept the gun. And I got another Doberman. And I realized that I had spent decades advocating for victims of crime. And if things were going to change, I had to learn how to advocate for myself. It was around that time that I remembered reading a really great book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. It's his memoir about his life in a Nazi concentration camp after he and his family were swept up in Hitler's Nazi fervor, put on cattle cars on trains and taken to the camps. His home and all his possessions gone. And one by one, he witnessed the murder of everyone dear to him and many, many, many others. He survived, and he credits his survival to an insight he had while in the camps. He realized that while they can take everything and everyone dear to him, the one thing they couldn't take was his ability to choose. Even if it was only his ability to choose his attitude about how he would relate to all of the atrocities that were all around him all the time. His ability to choose was his and his alone. They couldn't take that. And I realized I had that ability too. I had choices. I could stay home safely behind locked doors. I could take disability. I mean, I'd just been beaten and left for dead. Nobody would blame me. But I realized that that really was not how I had imagined my life would unfold. That is not really the story I had imagined telling my grandkids. Slowly realizing I had these choices, and if I was going to affect change, I had to advocate for myself. Slowly things started to shift. And it started primarily at the point where, when every ounce of my being wanted to stay inside behind the door with my dogs and my pistols, I opened the door and I stepped outside and I walked through that discomfort, that fear and anxiety, the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And then on another day I did it again. And I'm not saying it was easy, but what I do know is that those moments were life-changing for me. Making that choice to walk through the door with more discomfort and mental health heaviness than I have ever experienced was really very transformative. And I also gained a new perspective. I realized that these life-defining moments are so rare that they're really very special. My life had been totally torn apart. My world had been blown wide open, and I was literally brought to my knees. And then, miraculously, I was given a second chance. A chance to rebuild and reclaim my life, getting rid of what wasn't working and keeping only those things and people that were good and true. Sooner or later, everyone here is going to have one of those life-defining moments. And I can tell you there's only one thing that we know for sure is that everybody here in this room has this moment. This moment. There are no other guarantees. The important thing is to make the most of this moment, of all of your moments. Make good choices. Make mindful choices. Choose to be kind. Choose to stand up for something, for someone. Just stand up. When things happen in your life and you have this clarity that this moment is really the only thing I have right now, so let me give it everything. So what we have is a moment, and then we have moments, and we make of those what we will from the choices we make about those moments. The only thing I might suggest is one thing. Don't wait until you get a very powerful blow in the head. Don't wait until it's 4:56, because right now, this is your moment. These are all your moments. And after that is your moment. And after that is your moment. Choose mindfully. Make good choices. May all your moments be good.